Good evening and welcome to Guelph Museum's Military Lecture Series. My name is Ken Irvin. I'm the Education Coordinator at Guelph Museums, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone celebrating. And I'd like to also thank the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada for their partnership in this series. Tonight we're very pleased to have Dr. David Borys talk about his book, Civilians at the Sharp End, First Canadian Army Civil Affairs in Northwest Europe from 1944 to 1945. This talk will be about 45 minutes in length, and we'll have time at the end for some questions. And if you want to ask questions, just click on the Q&A menu, and which is at the top right of your screen, and click on the speech bubble. And to ask a question in the Q&A feature, select Ask a Question, type in your name or select Post as Anonymous, and then type in your question and select Send. And we'll see the question and answer it during the question and answer period. If you have any problems viewing tonight's talk, the presentation will be recorded and it is available on Guelph Museum's social media platforms. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Guelph is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Guelph Museums commits to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples. This commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it is my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. David Borys is a Canadian military historian and a faculty member at Langara College in Vancouver. His research focuses on the history of the relationship between the Canadian Armed Forces and civilian populations in combat zones. His published works include a wide variety of topics in the realm of Canadian military history and have been printed in academic journals such as the Canadian Military History Journal and in print media such as the Globe and Mail. His most recent book is titled Civilians at the Sharp End, First Canadian Army Civil Affairs in Northwest Europe, 1944 to 1945. And it's published by McGill Queen's Press. David has been seen on such television history programs as APTN's Nations at War and National Geographic's Hitler's Last Stands, which I have seen. David is also the producer, writer, and host of the popular Canadian history podcast, Cool Canadian History. And now I'd like to turn it over to David, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject. As mentioned, what we are going to talk about today is based on my research, and which became my book, the book titled Civilians at the Sharp End, First Canadian Army Civil Affairs in Northwest Europe. And for most people listening, and frankly for most people when they see the book, their first question is, what is civil affairs? And today what we're going to do is we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about where the civil affairs came from, what did it look like, how did it operate, and some of the major challenges that First Canadian Army Civil Affairs faced in Northwest Europe. And one of the big things I want you to think about here, but as we go through the lecture, is the fact that civil affairs is a branch of the Army, and it is responsible to First Canadian Army, and it is responsible just like any other branch of the military. And it is just a branch that has been designed with a very specific purpose in mind and is made up of a very unique collection of personnel to carry out that purpose. And so we're going to explore that today. So to begin with, I start with this photo. This is a photo of French refugees fleeing Paris. And in 1940, in the spring of 1940, a period that was known as the Phony War had come to an end, and Germany launched an invasion of Western Europe. And as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, this invasion was incredibly successful, and the French resistance and British resistance and Allied resistance collapsed fairly rapidly. One of the big problems with this rapid collapse of primarily the French defensive network was that French civilians began to flee the oncoming German military. And what happened was all of these refugees, what became tens of thousands of them, flooded the main transportation networks in France. What occurred when this happened was these masses of civilians fleeing the enemy, fleeing for their lives, trying to go west, began to impede and get in the way of active military operations. So there was people simply getting in the way. But on top of that, what ended up occurring was that the French military and the British military and ended up having to utilize their own resources to try to help, or at least to mitigate some of these problems encountered by these, tens of thousands of refugees that were getting in the way of sort of the ability for the French and the British to defend their regions. So this is a major issue. And what happens is, in the aftermath of the fall of France, so this is, post the British evacuation from Dunkirk, the French government falls, the Vichy government is put in its place, and you have sort of the Western Allies. Things look very grim, of course, by the summer of 1940, and you have the Western Allied leadership, despite things seeming grim, very much aware and very much discussing the fact that they will at some point return to the continent. But these images, the reality of refugees and civilian populations getting in the way of much of the military operations in France during this period of France's collapse, kind of haunted the Allied leadership as they begin to prepare for the eventual return to the continent. So what came out of this realization was that there needed to be an organization created that was within the military chain of command, that was responsible to the Allied military leadership, that could, in some capacity, deal with the civilian populations of what would eventually be liberated Europe. And the key here, and this is the fundamental point that is important to get across, is that this wasn't a humanitarian effort. This wasn't designed to help civilians first and foremost. This was designed to deal with civilian populations in a way that prevented the civilian populations from impeding military operations. This was a military operation first and foremost. It just would take on the form of what today we'd refer to as CIMIC, which is civil military cooperation. This would take the form of a branch of military specialists, of officers and soldiers and general infantry, all working with civilian populations so that they did not impede military operations. So that 1940 did not happen again when the Western Allies returned to Northwest Europe. And so out of these discussions in the summer of 1940 and through 40 into 41 is the birthplace. This is sort of the birthplace of what comes to be known as civil affairs. And it's important to note that civil affairs is not just a Canadian thing. There will be civil affairs branches in the American, the British Commonwealth, and the Canadian Army. So we see civil affairs branches be implemented and intertwined into the broader Allied military hierarchy throughout the course of 42, 43, 44. And this means, just like any branch of the military, artillery, armor, etc., there is a hierarchy. There are officers in charge at certain levels, and there's a wide breadth and depth of doctrine and knowledge that is being discussed and written about and practiced, both in practical and in sort of philosophical terms as well. So out of the chaos of 1940, we have this realization that a branch like civil affairs has to exist. And by about 1943, 44, we have in place what would become known as civil affairs. So, who is civil affairs? Who are the people that go into this branch? Because as I alluded to earlier on, the personnel that makes up civil affairs is not the same as the personnel that will often make up the combat units fighting on the front lines. You do, in civil affairs, have professional soldiers, soldiers who have served their entire careers within the Canadian or British military. Many of these, though, are officers who are either too old, deemed to be too old for combat service, or frankly were deemed unfit to lead in combat, either through their own sort of professional development, etc. So you do have sort of career soldiers. You also have soldiers who have been in the military that have specific skill sets or specific types of knowledge that can be applied to the various regions that will be liberated or to the various problems that civil affairs might encounter. And I'll explain more of that a little later. So you have soldiers that are a bit older but are still part of the military chain of command and structure. You have some soldiers with very specific skill sets. But you also have what we would call civilians turned soldiers. One of the interesting things about Canadian civil affairs is that the Canadian civil affairs, the Canadian military sought out civilians with specific kinds of experience. So one of the examples is art historians. Civil affairs recruited art historians into the structure, into the branch, because they knew that as they liberated Europe, they were going to need to find or recover stolen art. So academics were a major part of civil affairs. So of course, as a historian, I kind of connect to this idea as historians are being recruited into the military because they have specific knowledge about regions. Linguists, so people who were very knowledgeable about specific languages or had multiple languages or taught languages. We also have doctors, we have lawyers, we have judges, we have bankers. So this sort of very interesting collection of what we would identify as professionals in the civilian world are now being recruited into the military as captains and even majors to help head up and sort of provide the intellectual meat, the experiential meat in what is civil affairs. And in fact, just to give you an example, the top Canadian in civil affairs, that is the civil affairs officer who ran Canadian civil affairs from the headquarters of 1st Canadian Army, was a man named Basil Wedd, W-E-D-D. Now, Wedd is really interesting. Wedd was born in Toronto. He was a decorated First World War veteran. After the First World War, he went into the civilian world, into the professional world, into the corporate world. And in fact, when war broke out, Wedd had spent years as the European representative for a company known as the Massey Harris Company. And this is actually one of Canada's first multinational corporations. It actually sold agricultural equipment in Europe. So here's Wedd. He has a bit of war experience, not a bit, he has war experience from the First World War, and he spent the interwar period basically traveling around Europe, meeting people, learning languages, learning customs and cultures. Well, this is the man who's given the supreme sort of the top civil affairs job in 1st Canadian Army. He will become the head of Canadian civil affairs. And that just gives you an example of the kind of resumes that civil affairs was looking for. So now the question is, how did civil affairs work? What was the structure? I won't go into too much detail, but I want to give you a sense of what it would have looked like when 1st Canadian Army landed in northern France and began its liberation route, towards Holland. I want to give you a sense of what it would have looked like. Oh, here's just a nice little photo of civil affairs officers putting up a newspaper, little newspaper office where they would help create or print newspapers. I forgot about that photo there. It's a nice one. So here is the structure of civil affairs in practicality. So you would have your Army headquarters, which would be 1st Canadian Army headquarters, and you would have in your headquarters what's called a senior civil affairs officer. And this senior civil affairs officer at 1st Canadian Army headquarters was Wedd. And so And then at the headquarters for the corps formation, so you'd have one Canadian Corps, 2 Canadian Corps, etc. You would have another senior civil affairs officer. So and then down below it, corps made up of the multiple divisions, you would have at each division headquarters another senior civil affairs officer. So every headquarters from army to division would have a senior civil affairs officer with a small group that would work around him. So they would always be in constant communication with the division's commanding officer, the corps commanding officer, and 1st Canadian Army's commanding officer, Harry Criar. At the same time, these senior civil affairs officers would be responsible for a wide number of what we called detachments. And these detachments were at the front lines. And you would have, just to give you sort of an example of how these detachments operated, when the 1st Canadian Army would enter into a region, spearhead detachments, often a few guys in a truck or a couple jeeps, would ride into the local village or town. They would then begin to sort of assess the immediate needs of that region or town. And so this would be, contacting local resistance, contacting local officials, contacting maybe former mayors prior to the occupation. And they would sort of create a long list of issues that needed to be solved in that region. What they would do is these spearhead detachments would then pass that list to bigger, more complex static detachments. And these static detachments would come in behind the spearhead ones. They would then set up a permanent place or a permanent position in those key villages or towns or regions where they would then spend time trying to actually solve the wide variety of problems and issues that were affecting these regions that had been recently liberated. And and broadly speaking, these problems were problems with food, problems with shelter, problems with medicine, problems with law and order, problems with health issues, problems with refugees. And within these sort of categories was a wide variety of challenges that changed dramatically with every region that was liberated by 1st Canadian Army. And then after the spearhead detachments sort of handed off, the static detachments, the spearhead detachments will then keep moving forward with the combat troops. So this is important to understand that basically every time a Canadian combat soldier entered into a new area, not far behind that soldier were the men of civil affairs. And the minute a place was cleared, these civil affairs officers, these detachments, would begin to work on helping to rebuild that region, trying to get the people back on their feet, trying to quickly rebuild that region, because the ultimate purpose here was to get these civilian populations operating on their own. And if you did that in enough regions, you would get the country finally back on its own. And if the country was finally back on its own, that country could then join the war effort. So by fixing the problems in these regions, the whole goal was to eventually hand over control of these regions back to the civilian authorities in France and Belgium and the Netherlands. And then those countries could now begin to fight the war alongside the Allies much more effectively. So picture in your mind this period of military control, basically administered by the civil affairs authorities in the region, followed by a gradual transition back to civilian control. And that's effectively how the operation worked. But the best way to really understand how it worked is to look at some of the examples. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us through a quick journey from northern France into Germany, and we're going to sort of identify some of the key problems that civil affairs were dealing with in each region. So let's begin in France. And one of the key themes in France, just like back in 1940, was the issue of civilian populations moving around, what they called refugee movement. And so in France, civil affairs was really focused on making sure that these large civilian populations, all from these urban areas, did not impede military operations. And when we talk about the civil affairs experience in France, we need to focus on the city of Caen. So Caen was liberated by July 1944. But the fighting to liberate the city resulted in wide-scale damage, as you can see in these photos here, but also thousands and thousands of civilian casualties, both from German and Allied bombing and shelling of the city. When the Canadians and British first entered the streets of Caen in July 1944, tens of thousands of civilians were living in this rubble-strewn environment. They were effectively homeless, living in makeshift shelters, underground caves. They were living in forests or fields. There was no electricity. There was no sanitation. There was no running water. There was no law and order. And at the same time, there's fighting going on throughout the city as the Allies are trying to liberate it. So basically, with every block that was cleared by Canadian combat soldiers, civil affairs began to work on trying to bring the city back online, to use a modern term. Now, one of the big problems was that so many civilians were living in Caen and there had been already so many civilian casualties that the primary goal for civil affairs was to get the civilians out of the city while fighting was going on. And if they could clear the city of civilians, then they could not only reduce civilian casualties from the ongoing fighting, but they could also begin to effectively work on rebuilding the city as well. So civil affairs, which was part of, at this time, the 2nd Canadian Corps Civil Affairs was responsible for this. They drew up a massive evacuation plan. And what would happen is these thousands and thousands of civilians would be transported out of the city via military vehicles. They would then be sent north to areas already liberated that were free of Germans, to these established reception centers. And at these reception centers, they would be fed, they'd find shelter, they'd get given medical care. And this process, it was a massive, massive evacuation scheme. Through this scheme, tens of thousands of civilians were evacuated from the city. And oftentimes, they were being evacuated as German artillery was raining shells down on the city. And so this was a very dangerous period. This was a period of intense casualties, both for combat soldiers, but also for civilians. And once the city had been evacuated, those same civilians were not allowed to return to the city until Canadian Civil Affairs had given the all clear. But even when it was evacuated, and even when the all clear was given, the work only just began, because of course there was massive destruction everywhere, as these two photos also show. And with this massive destruction meant that now civil affairs had to turn their attention to rebuilding the city. And so how do you rebuild a city? Well, first you use what resources you have at hand, so a lot of military resources. But another way you rebuild the city is through cooperation with local, human power. So civil affairs recruited resistance groups, they recruited local aid organizations, they hired civilians, and they basically built this sort of civil administrative organization that began to help rebuild the city. And this process took some time because, of course, Caen was almost totally demolished in the fighting. But this was a major task that Canadian civil affairs officers had become responsible for. Now, what's really interesting about this story in France is that the evacuation model that civil affairs used to clear the city of civilians basically became the standard doctrine for evacuations throughout the rest of Northwest Europe. And what's really interesting is while 3,000 civilians died at Caen, throughout the rest of the fighting in urban areas in Northwest Europe, we see civilian casualties either non-existent or extremely small in number. And what this shows us is that after Caen, this civil affairs organization had developed an extremely effective model at either clearing civilians out of the battle zone prior to or during combat. And so in many ways in France, the story was the success of developing this model to help remove civilians from the battle space. And then they went to Belgium and things were a little different. In Belgium, there wasn't as much serious fighting in the country itself. And in fact, when the Canadians liberated Belgium, it was in a much better condition than in northern France. So while refugee movement and civilian movement would always be an issue, Belgium saw a very unique problem arise, and that was the problem of resistance groups. You see, during the war, a recognized Belgian government in exile had been in England, had been in London. Upon liberation, this government in exile arrives in Belgium and to take the mantle of political leadership. The problem was many resistance groups resented the fact that this political group in exile was now in charge of the country, when many resistance leaders felt that they should be the ones that were now politically in charge. So you had tension between resistance groups and the recognized Belgian government, recognized by the Western Allies. But you also had another problem, and that was many of the resistance groups didn't get along with each other. And you had resistance groups that came from different political ideologies or different religious backgrounds or different regions or different languages that were at odds with one another. So there were, and what we see when the Canadians liberate this country, we actually start seeing resistance groups arresting and punishing rival resistance members. And what they would do is they would do this under the guise that these resistant groups were actually collaborators. And they started everybody started accusing their rivals of being collaborators. And these resistance groups, who were still very well armed, were basically trying to make power moves in the vacuum of that had been created after liberation. And this got extremely problematic because the Belgian police force that the Canadian Civil Affairs were trying to set up had very limited weapons. The resistance groups were very well armed, and it came down on the Canadians, the Canadian military, to effectively solve the problem. I'll give you one example. In late September 1944, in the town of Ypres, which is, for those of you who know the Canadian history in World War I, a very, very, very famous town. The Canadians in World War I nicknamed it Wipers. In Ypres, in September 1944, that major city, the mayor of that major city was dealing with 3 resistance groups in the city. And all 3 of these resistance groups, who were well armed, were effectively becoming none other than armed gangs that controlled different sections of the city. And they were robbing from the rival territories. They were arresting members from rival resistance groups. And the city had descended into this lawlessness where these armed resistance groups were effectively the brute force authority. Now, the mayor of Ypres had set out to try to rein them in. He couldn't do it. And this was part of the reason was the resistance group's leaders all felt that they should be the political authority in the city, not this mayor who had effectively been put in charge by the local allies, by effectively Canadian Civil Affairs had said, we're going to pick you as the mayor for now. So what happens? Well, the mayor basically turns to the Civil Affairs officer known as Colonel J.J. Hurley. And Hurley was the senior civil affairs officer for 2nd Canadian Corps. And he basically writes him a long letter saying, I am dealing with these extremely fractious resistance groups. They are effectively armed gangs that are roaming the city. I am very concerned about law and order. I'm concerned about my own safety as the recognized political authority. So Hurley drives to Ypres from 2nd Canadian Corps headquarters, and he calls a meeting of the resistance leaders. They all sit down, things are very tense, and it seems like at first, based on the diaries and the reports that I read, it seemed like at first that these resistant leaders were expecting to push Hurley over. They expected him not to be able to tell them what to do. But Hurley made it completely clear that in no uncertain terms, in no uncertain terms are the resistance groups allowed to operate in the city as resistance organizations. He said, in no uncertain terms, the mayor is the recognized authority of the Allies. He said that if you disobey the mayor, if you do not follow the political authority we recognize, you will be in contravention of Allied military government law, basically meaning you will not be an ally of the Allies, you will be our enemy. And just to top it off, as he's laying down the law, he says, if you choose to disobey this, you will then be met with the full force of the Canadian Army. And finally, he says, and we are also going to begin collecting the weapons from all three of your groups, and we expect you to comply. And so Hurley basically went in and made it very clear that if these resistance groups do not or continue to disobey or operate as these sort of armed gangs, that the Canadian military will be coming in to enforce law and order, to collect weapons, and to disband the groups. And what's incredible is this diary talks about this long back and forth, and Hurley getting extremely frustrated and finally sort of losing his temper and saying this. And then after he sort of makes it very clear that they will have to obey the will of the Allied military authority, the war diary writes, and I quote, "This seemed to settle the matter." So in basically this one meeting, here is the senior civil affairs officer of the 2nd Canadian Corps telling these resistant leaders, it's time to put down your weapons and obey. One of the interesting things, just as a side note, that really helped sort of take away a lot of the momentum of these resistance groups is that as the Canadians liberated Belgium, they began to set up this Free Belgian Army, and there were Free Belgians who were serving alongside the Allies all throughout Northwest Europe. And a lot of the younger members of the resistance groups were basically told, if you want to continue in this fight, you can't do so in this resistance group, but you can do so as part of the Belgian army. So you see this big recruiting drive that sort of takes away a lot of the personnel, a lot of the bodies that made up a lot of these groups. And this, coupled with basically threats of enforcement by the Canadian military authority, this combined sort of settles this very convoluted and complicated issue in Belgium. So we have refugee movement in northern France, which becomes turns into the reconstruction of the destroyed city of Caen as one problem, we call it two problems. We have in the city of Belgium, of course, we have fractious and hostile resistance groups that are basically coerced into settling down and either joining the military or stepping aside and recognizing local Allied authority. And then they move into the Netherlands. And what I'm about to say here is probably no surprise to many of our listeners. In the Netherlands, the biggest problem was food. Simply put, by the time that the Allies entered the Netherlands in 1944, in the fall of 1944, the Dutch people were starving. The German occupation authority had, since 1940, stripped the country of its food, of its coal, and of much of its people. And by the winter of 1944-45, there was such little food throughout the country, especially in the urban areas, that it was deemed, or has been known now as, the hunger winter. And especially in Western Netherlands, where there's the larger urban populations, where the urban populations had grown over the course of the war, there is some very, very real concerns about starvation. And these reports are starting to come back to the Canadians in greater and greater numbers as the Canadians begin to liberate chunks of the country beginning in the fall of 1944. But by the early spring of 1945, things began to get quite serious. In fact, so much so that the royal family, the Dutch royal family, in exile, writes a plea to the Allied leadership to do something about what seems to be a humanitarian disaster on epic proportions about to occur. And there is very, very real reports saying, if we don't do something now, we will be too late. We'll be talking about tens of thousands of Dutch dying. And a lot of Canadian soldiers talk about it in the places they did liberate, how they would see these people, like in these photos here, just starving, and so these, like, children's growth was stunted, and elderly people just lying in the streets because they couldn't move anywhere because they didn't have the energy to get out of bed, or people just dying in the streets, and soldiers are writing about this. So there's two problems right now. Number one, some leaders in the Canadian Army and in the senior Allied leadership are saying, look, the best thing for these people is just to beat the Germans, end the war, and then we enter the country. Others, though, are starting to say, I think we need to take a different approach. And the different approach is chosen. And what ends up happening is in late April 1945, Civil Affairs basically facilitates negotiations with the German occupation authority to set up a truce. And this truce would then allow for the Allies to deliver food to basically the western half of the Netherlands, where starvation was so acute. Now, the British and the Americans take part in this through something known as Operations Manna and Chowhound. Operation Manna was the British airlift effort, and Operation Chowhound was the American one. So you have basically an agreed upon corridor upon which Allied bombers could fly through, and they flew from Allied territory into occupied Dutch territory, so basically into the area still occupied by the German military, and they dropped foodstuffs all throughout this area. So these were major efforts of bringing food to Western Netherlands. But the Canadians, and specifically Civil Affairs, 1st Canadian Army Civil Affairs, did their own operation. And this is a really interesting operation. It's known as Operation Faust, or Fist. And effectively, Operation Faust was a massive convoy effort. Something like 360 trucks in groups of 30 effectively crossed into German-occupied territory every 30 minutes. And they drove deep into German-held territory. They dropped off their supplies, as seen in the photo on the left, and then they turned around and went back. And for something like 8 days, this convoy delivered approximately 1,000 tons of food a day. And so Operation Faust was the civil affairs operation that was part of this broader relief effort of the Dutch. And of course, as many of our listeners probably know, the Dutch and Canada have a very special relationship. And a lot of this special relationship stems from these efforts, not just liberating the country, but trying to feed them in very dangerous and desperate times. Now, I want to cap off my discussion of civil affairs with a very interesting story that wraps up my book, and that is Germany. Because by the fall of 1944, of course, in late 1944, I mean, Canadians start to enter Germany. And what's really interesting is that civil affairs doesn't stop when it enters Germany. In fact, civil affairs gets a name change, and this name change is military government. Now, don't be fooled by the name change, though, because, of course, if there's a change in perspective, these are not friendly Allied civilians. These are enemy peoples that are now being occupied. They're not the French, the Belgians, the Dutch were liberated. The Germans are being occupied. So there is a change in perspective. But what's important to understand is their jobs don't really change. Military government, that is literally civil affairs officers are now being military government officers, their jobs are still to deal with the civilian population in a way that ensures that that civilian population doesn't impede broader military operation efforts. So what does that mean in terms of this practical example? Well, in one example is the first thing that civil affairs does when they enter a region in Germany, and the Canadians were specifically in northwestern Germany. When they entered into a town or village, the first thing they did is they found out who were the Nazis. And they conducted a program called denazification. And what this meant is they would go in and they started interviewing people. They brought together all the local political officials, and they found out who was a Nazi. And literally they had a form that these people had to fill out. And the form would say, how long have you been a member of the party? What was your job before the war, etc., etc. And through a very complicated process, and a process obviously full of gaps and holes, they slowly but surely began to remove Nazi officials from political authority and replace them with German civilians who were amenable to cooperating with the Allies. So sometimes it would mean like mayors who lost their jobs because they weren't Nazi, never joined the Nazi party. Sometimes it might mean a local political official who joined the Nazi party in the last 6 months of the war. And sometimes it would mean no one at all, and they couldn't find anyone, then the civil affairs would effectively be in charge. So that was one very interesting task. But another really interesting task, and one that is probably the most controversial, is that civil affairs was also responsible for tens of thousands of liberated prisoners of war, slave laborers, and of course, prisoners of concentration camps. And it was the task of civil affairs to help get these people home. And for, of course, concentration camp survivors, they first had to take care of these people and get them into shape, get them back into some sort of shape that they could finally repatriate themselves back to whichever country they came from. So Canadian Civil Affairs was tasked with basically sorting out all these POWs, all these concentration camp survivors, all these slave laborers, and figuring out who had to go west, who had to go east, and trying to make sure that they could do that in an organized, coherent, and lawful manner. So they were feeding them, they were setting up what was called displaced persons camps, and these DP camps would be where these people would live until they could be moved to their place. And while that was one task, another task, which was even more problematic, was that because so many of these, especially prisoners of war, were liberated from these camps, they began to take revenge on the local German civilian population. So you can imagine slave laborers, concentration camp survivors, and prisoners of war who have now been freed. Germany is beaten, or Germany is close to being beaten. And these displaced persons, many displaced persons, began to attack local towns and villages and just random German civilians. And this incredibly dark period of theft, murder, rape, and assault occurs, where the Canadian Civil Affairs are now placed in a position where they have to protect German civilians from the depredations of certain groups of displaced persons. And this is very complicated because these displaced persons are Soviet prisoners, they're maybe Dutch prisoners of war or Dutch slave laborers, or most of these displaced persons come from countries that are deemed allies. So these persons are allies to the Canadians. The Germans are enemies and conquered enemy population. And yet Canadian Civil Affairs now has to start to establish some sort of ability to protect these German civilians from these sort of marauding gangs of displaced persons. And it's even more complicated because many Canadians, and this is in the diaries and in the firsthand accounts, many Canadian soldiers simply don't care. Many Canadian soldiers say, we don't care if we fail at this job because these have been our enemy for this long. And there's a number of reports that I came across of Canadian soldiers saying these German civilians got what they deserved. And it's a really dark time during this period, and it's Civil Affairs' job to try to protect these people. Now, in the end, the attacks stop. What ends up happening is the Civil Affairs officers and the detachments in these regions basically go to whoever is deemed to be in charge of, let's say, the Russian displaced persons camp, or the Polish one, or the Dutch one, etc. And they basically negotiate with these lead officers to rein their men in. But what happens, though, and these reports make it very clear, that when Canadian Civil Affairs leaves the region, when the Canadian Army actually leaves the region and a British occupation force comes in, the reports come back to the Canadians that the attacks started up again. So a new army moved in, they had no relationship with the leaders of these camps, and the German civilians were once again subject to a fairly brutal revenge and reprisal attacks. So what we see then is in every country, in every region that Canadian Civil Affairs entered, different challenges and tasks awaited them. And it was extremely important. And in fact, this story in the book, and you can see this in the book, that it was extremely important for the civil affairs officers, the detachment commanders, the headquarters commanders, to be as flexible as possible and to be able to utilize a variety of skills to deal with the immense task of civilian populations. But it's clear that they are immensely successful. In France, we see the reduction of civilian casualties. In Belgium, we see the establishment of law and order. In Dutch, we see the staving off of an epic starvation crisis. And in Germany, we eventually see the effective repatriation of displaced persons. In fact, if we looked at the bigger picture, the Americans, the British, the Canadians, much of the ability for the liberated countries to get themselves on their own 2 feet again was the work of civil affairs. These officers, these soldiers who are often written out of the record, who we often don't see in pictures and who we don't read about in the more common reports. In fact, Basil Wedd, I can't even find a photo of him. I struggled to find a photo of the leader of the Canadian Civil Affairs because these guys were simply considered, they weren't the ones being taken photos of or being written about in sort of any extensive way. But I think the bigger takeaway is that the strong relationship that Canada had in the post-war years and still has with many of these countries is a direct result of the effective work of civil affairs in helping to feed people, care for people, provide medicine, food, shelter, and then help them reestablish and reconstruct their urban cities and their broader countries as a whole. Truly, it is the civil affairs officers that were the actual soldiers who were right there at the very point where civilians met the sharp end of war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating, and I'm amazed that this story hasn't been told before, because it is really fascinating. There's so many different facets to the story, and I'm in awe of the diplomatic skills these guys must have had to be able to deal with all of the different challenges that faced them post-war. So it's an amazing story, and I'm surprised it hasn't been told before. Why do you think it hasn't been told?
I think I think that, I think the thing is that people seem to want to focus on the battles, and they want to focus on, some of the key events of the Second World War for Canada's, Dieppe and the liberation of the Dutch and things like that. And effectively, the story kind of just got buried in the archives. And it was only through sheer luck while I was doing my dissertation at the University of New Brunswick that I sort of stumbled on this unit. And me and my advisor, Mark Milner, started to wonder who these guys were. And that turned into my dissertation. And I was very fortunate that in both Great Britain and in Canada, there's a treasure trove of archival material on this branch.
Did you ever find a picture of Basil Wedd?
Well, we did. There was one of him in the First World War, but I never found one of him in uniform in the Second World War.
And did the Brits and the Americans also have civilian affairs divisions?
Yep, absolutely. And the Americans, in fact, still have civil affairs today. The name has changed in Canada and Great Britain. But what's interesting is that in the U.S. and British historiography, civil affairs is written about much more extensively. In Canada, there was maybe a couple articles on it, and that was about it. But in Britain, there was a couple of books of official histories on the branch, and in the United States, same thing.
Yeah, it seems like something we should be very proud of, the work that was done here.
Yeah, and especially because the liberation of the Dutch is such a prominent theme in our war memory experience. Well, that story of the Dutch is a civil affairs story more than anything, and yet it was sort of written out of the record or just never talked about. Not maliciously, just sort of absent.
Okay, one of the big questions I have is, because of the massive logistics to bring men and material in after the D-Day invasion, how did they get enough material to help the civilians? Like, to bring that was a huge amount of material too. Absolutely,
and the way this is what makes it so important to understand civil affairs being a formal branch of the military chain of command. Because just like artillery or the armor or any branch, civil affairs had its own logistic chain line. They had their own supply chain. And so what would happen is, from the smallest village would put in a request for, one of the weirder requests was 500 braziers. This village in the Netherlands needed bras. And they put in the request, and the request went back to a civil affairs depot. They didn't have it there, so that went further back to a larger depot where they found these women's undergarments and shipped them all the way up to this small village on the Dutch frontier. So there was this sort of logistic supply chain that civil affairs used. But another issue, though, was that often it wasn't enough in some of these larger urban centers, and that's why the civil affairs working at headquarters made such a difference, as they could turn to let's say the combat supply chain and say, can we have rations? Can we get fuel? Things like that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Did they have to deal with the black market at all and the underground?
Yeah, the black market was a major problem in every country they entered, and part of and in the book I talk extensively about, especially in the Netherlands and Belgium, how much of a problem that was. And again, the task fell on civil affairs to try to figure out a way to deal with that. And sometimes they were successful, and sometimes it took them a long time to sort of deal with it or mitigate the issues.
And I'm also wondering, did they have their own legal department and court system that to be able to try people for any indiscretions?
Yes, they did. In fact, they had an entire legal department. So when you go into the documents, there's sort of about 12 areas where civil affairs focuses on, and one of the departments is law. Another one is banking, actually, very interesting. And so they would have Canadian lawyers trained in French law or Belgian law, or Canadian soldiers who took courses in it, moving into cities to help reestablish the court systems, help reappoint judges or find new ones if the judges had been co-opted as part of the occupying force. So that was a major part of it.
And did they recruit lawyers from Canada to come over and do this?
Oh yeah, yep.
And judge, like, people would leave their legal practices and come over and
yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean, it was serving your country, and this was an opportunity for, like, I think about these gentlemen, like, most of these officers were, late 20s and their 30s, some into their 40s, and as a 40-year-old, I like to think I'm still young, but at that time, if you were 40 years old, you were too old for combat service, so you ended up serving in another capacity.
When the Canadian forces were in Germany, did civilian affairs look after the German prisoners of war? Was that something they were
no,
with?
that was a military. That would be under what was called field security, or the provost, which was like sort of the military police. They would be generally operating those. The civil affairs / military government only operated with displaced persons from foreign countries,
okay,
and civilians.
And did they have their own military police force, or was that a different section?
What they would do is they had field security sections that worked under the umbrella of civil affairs.
Okay. Okay. And are there any stories of any indiscretions that they sort of turned a blind eye to, that they let fly after the war?
No, I mean, there are real reports, and I've read firsthand accounts of field security soldiers and civil affairs officers not purposefully going after groups of displaced persons who would attack civilian populations. So there are examples of them just saying, we're not going to bother with this, but there's many more examples of them saying, we have to do something about this. But it's very clear that many Canadians were struggling. Many Canadian soldiers in civil affairs and field security were struggling with this component of the occupation, because they just spent their entire war hating the German civilian population for supporting Hitler and hating Germany. And now they were being told to protect German civilians, and that really rankled a lot of them. Especially those who had seen their friends die, and injured and maimed in the fighting, right?
Yeah. Well, my father was a lieutenant in the service corps in the war, and one of his drivers had his brother was killed just close to the end of the war, and he, I guess this driver was pretty upset about having to repatriate some German prisoners. Yeah. And while they were driving through Germany, I guess some of the prisoners were hanging out the back of the truck and sort of waving at all the Fraulein's, and this one driver drove a little too close to some light posts and took the head off a soldier, and my father just turned a blind eye to it, because it was just, what are you going to do? Yep. Just let it go.
I would argue that many Canadian soldiers were dealing with similar tension,
Yeah, so I know what happened. So yeah, being a museum person, I'm curious about the art historians. Where did they recruit these guys from that were part of the civilian force?
Well, so my book doesn't really, I should make clear, my book is definitely not the official history on it. I approach the book as taking a sort of narrative approach with the major problems in each town. So the history on the art history is yet to be written, but effectively these were art historians. There's actually a really famous, not famous movie, but a movie called Monuments Men with George Clooney, and Canada had its very own version of that. These sort of academics, effectively, who were brought into the armed forces to go and find these pieces.
Were there any major artworks that were recovered by these guys?
There were, and I don't know the names of them, so I apologize.
Okay, but there were collections, I guess.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. A lot of church collections from churches.
Was there a branch of civilian affairs working in Italy as well?
Yeah, great question. It wasn't called Civil Affairs yet. It was called Allied Military Government, AMG. And in many ways, Italy was sort of the classroom, They sort of worked out a lot of bugs. And Italy is its own sort of complicated story where many persons in Allied leadership were very, very skeptical about the effectiveness of civil affairs. In fact, the reason it does get the name civil affairs is because the Allied military government by late 1943 had become sort of synonymous with a bad organization, and they needed a name change and a facelift before they went into Northwest Europe. And I spent a whole bunch of time on Italy in the book as well, where we identify a number of issues.
Okay, great. I'm down to the last couple of questions. Did civilian affairs look after any dealings between the Canadian soldiers and maybe liaisons with some of the females in the occupied countries?
Sure, yeah. Like there was certainly a lot of worry about venereal disease. That was a major problem within the Canadian military. There was concerns about prostitution, and so you had the civil affairs health authorities would often be the ones responsible for going into towns or regions and either registering or finding who the prostitutes or where the brothels were, or responsible for trying to counter venereal disease or the spread of it. But it wasn't very successful. The Canadians, like in the First World War, had some of the highest rates of venereal disease in the Western Allied forces.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have, Dave, for tonight. You answered all of them perfectly. Thank you.
There's actually one more question, Ken. Sorry.
One more question?
There is one question.
Wait.
Oh,
I've got it here. Can our civil affairs become part of the Ukrainian resettlement?
Well, we don't have civil affairs anymore. We have what's called CIMIC, and it's a sort of a fusion of the military and civilian agencies and different intelligence agencies in Canada. They would only be in there if the military went in there, and if the military doesn't go in, then we would not be sending them separately or without backing from, because they are still part of the full Canadian military.
Okay, thanks. Well, once again, thank you again for a really enlightening and really interesting talk. And I'm really surprised I don't know very much about the civilian affairs part. And it's such a great story to be told. And it's, again, a way Canadians don't pat themselves on the back for the amazing work that they did. So it's a great story that I'm glad you have told it, Dave.
Thank you.
I'd also want to remind people to join us next month. We have another, our last speaker for the season. And this one is, again, from the West Coast. Dr. Jeffrey Bird from the Royal Roads University in Victoria, BC. He's giving a presentation entitled "The Torch, Be Yours to Hold It High, Heritage, Meaning, and Remembering Well in the 21st Century." And that's on Thursday, April 14th at 7 o'clock. And that will be our final presentation for the spring season. And we will return in the fall with more amazing speakers. I also want to just let people know that on November 25th, we are going to have a Lieutenant Colonel John Mccrae Symposium because it's John's 150th birthday this year, and we'll host a symposium at the museum on John Mccrae and his life, and we've got some amazing speakers already lined up. Just to let everyone know that Guelph Museums is still open to the public. No appointments are necessary. And we have a couple new exhibits out and on display. So check our website and come in and check out our new exhibits. And next Friday, we have another one of our Fourth Friday concerts on March 25th. And Eve Archer is performing at the Civic at 7 o'clock on the 25th. So get your tickets for that. It is a free performance. And again, thanks so much for joining us, Dave, and thank you for all the people who attended tonight and the great questions. And I look forward to seeing you next month, and happy St. Patrick's Day.